Hey guys, Liquid here, and this is a video targeted at people interested in learning classical Japanese, in which I will be showing off resources that I have found useful. First off, if you do want to learn classical Japanese, I would personally recommend knowing modern Japanese to some degree first, as some of the resources I'm going to be focusing on are in modern Japanese, and also a lot of the memorization of conjugations and whatnot can be subverted by knowing modern Japanese. Though in theory, I do believe that someone could learn classical Japanese without knowing modern Japanese. For an honorable mention, I will first talk about the website Imabi. First and foremost, this is a guide for modern Japanese written in English that in general goes very in-depth, perhaps at times a bit too much. The site also has a classical Japanese section that may be of use to you. Ironically, I find English sources tend to be a little overcomplicated, but if it works for you, check it out. Now, the main part of this video will be a review of a series of textbooks written by Mochitsuki Ko, who is a teacher of classical Japanese. Specifically, I will be looking in detail at two of his textbooks, Kobun Kyoshitsu and Mochitsuki Ko no Kobun Tango 333. I originally was also going to discuss resources on Kanbun, or a method of reading classical Chinese and classical Japanese, but decided that that was ultimately beyond the scope of this video. I will then touch upon Classical Japanese, a Grammar by Haruo Shirane. First up, Kobun Kyoshitsu. This is made for Japanese students preparing for college entry exams, and especially those who have had a hard time with classical Japanese in the past, so it's intentionally written in a way to alleviate the learner's anxiety. To get it out of the way, this book manages to be informative, while at the same time very simple, so I think that this book makes for an excellent introduction to classical Japanese. It's so simple, in fact, that if I were a Japanese person, I might even feel like I was being condescended to. After a few chapters going over conjugations and whatnot, most of the book is a few pages dedicated to one auxiliary verb or a group of related auxiliary verbs. Mochitsuki will include some example sentences from native material before explaining the meaning and usage of these auxiliary verbs. He also goes to the effort to help the learner differentiate between the similar and easily confused auxiliary verbs. There is also a lengthy section on keigo, or honorific language, with cute illustrations. At the very end of the book, there is a large reference chart that summarizes pretty much everything taught in the book. One complaint I have is that towards the end of the book, the author gets a little lazy and starts rushing through auxiliary verbs and stops giving example sentences. For example, in this page on maoshi and tashi, there's only a brief description of their meanings with not one example, and these two auxiliary verbs are given only one page. Another complaint is that the author often disregards certain grammar points, saying something along the lines of, "This is unlikely to appear on the entrance exams," or in reverse, will stress a certain grammar saying, "This is very likely to show up on the entrance exams." I wouldn't have a problem with this if it was just a case of this grammar isn't that common, so you shouldn't worry about it. But instead, I often feel like a potentially useful piece of grammar is being waved in front of my face. Next up, Mochitsuki Ko no Kobun Tango 333, which is a vocabulary builder featuring 333 classical Japanese vocabulary words. Some people may look at this type of thing as a waste of time, as one could just as easily learn vocabulary from reading and looking up unknown words. But as I flip through, you'll notice that many, if not most, of the words in this book are words that already exist in modern Japanese. This is because many words had very different meanings in classical Japanese, and without knowing that, it would be very easy to misunderstand or misconstrue the meaning of a text. For example, in modern Japanese, the word sunowachi means "in other words," or which is to say, whereas in classical Japanese, it also had the meaning of immediately. Before I had used this book and learned this, Whenever I looked at classical Japanese texts and saw the word sunowachi, I would always try to force my understanding of the word into the text, or completely ignore the word altogether. But now that I know that other meaning, I won't be confused anymore. As for the structure of the book, each word is given a definition, or several definitions depending on the word, and a page or two explaining the definition, perhaps some etymology notes, and an explanation of how the different definitions tie in with one another. There is also one example sentence for each word written by Mochitsuki himself. Because there is only one example sentence per word, words with multiple varying definitions only get one example for only one of their definitions. One complaint that I have is that sometimes the 333 vocabulary word claim feels a little fudged. For example, here, on the page for the word irao, meaning to answer, the word irae, meaning an answer, is also featured and included as a separate entry. However, this slot could have easily been given to another word, as seeing as it's explained that irao is a shimo nidan verb, this tells the reader that the rinyoke, which is often used for making nouns, would be irae. Thus, having only been taught irao, a reader who then encounters irae would likely be able to surmise its meaning. In between sections, there are also some special pages, like this part, showing many euphemisms for death. At the end of the book is a small booklet, and the book contains a red filter that can block out red text. Used together with this booklet, one can use it to hide the answers to a quiz, or use it to use the booklet like flashcards. I found this to be a very neat feature, as I've never seen this type of thing before, but apparently it's common with Japanese textbooks. Last, I will briefly touch upon Classical Japanese, a Grammar by Haruo Shirane. First things first, this book is very large in both length and thickness, though the text is fairly large. The explanations are all in English, with the Japanese being written in Romaji, as well as the native script, and all of the example sentences are taken from actual classical literature. This was actually the first resource I used to try to learn classical Japanese, and my retention was personally very low, since I feel this book tends to be a bit too complicated for beginners, so I think it could be a good supplement to Mochitsuki's textbooks. One aspect that I commend is these historical notes, which often explain Nara period grammar. The book seems to treat these notes as little tidbits, but personally I find them just as valuable as any other information, as information on Nara period Japanese is rather scarce, and it comes in handy if you want to try to read something like the Manyō Shū. The book continues with a fairly set structure until the end, when it changes into grammar exercises. Once you've gone through a textbook, be it one that I've showed or something else, the best way then to increase your understanding of classical Japanese will be to try to read classical texts. Seeing as these texts are very old, most popular texts can be found online, though you may need to do some searching. In terms of difficulty, two texts I feel are relatively easy for first-time classical Japanese reading are Hojoki and Taketori Monogatari. Hojoki can be found on Aozora Bunko, and several variations of Taketori Monogatari can be found by googling something like Taketori Monogatari Genbun. Also, while it's actually from the 19th and 20th centuries, the Meiji and Taisho translations of the Bible should also make for some fairly easy reading, while also acclimating you to classical Japanese verb conjugation and other elements. Hopefully this video has been of some assistance to you, and good luck on your classical Japanese endeavors. Liquid out.